Hello, hello, hello. Happy Friday, everyone. How is everyone doing today? Let's get all this set up right. Good morning, John. Good morning, Sterling. Good morning, Patrick. Happy Friday to you. Thank you for putting in the earnings, Sterling. Yes, Alta Beauty beat. There weren't many big earnings this morning. Good morning, McRangers, or yesterday afternoon. Good morning, Eric. Good morning, PMG. What PMG? The lunar eclipse was amazing. I did not see it. I was actually not feeling very good yesterday. I was in bed by 8 p.m. It was an early night for me. Tesla. What's that in reference to? What else do we have going on? Um, what else? Good morning, Heinrich. Sorry, I'm just trying to scroll through all the comments. There's lots of stuff going on. Sterling, thank you for posting it. Good morning, Royal Palms. Hello, Charles. All right. We're waiting for more people to come in. By the way, gold futures hit 3K yesterday. So, in terms of news today, we have the consumer sentiment numbers, the preliminary for March. That's about it. Going to be watching whether the inflation expectations drop from last month's sky high number of 4.3%. So that's going to be interesting. But these are still the preliminary numbers. The market is still very oversold, and now we have stronger potential bottoming patterns. So these are going to determine whether we're going to get the bounce play or whether we're just going to stay in sideways correction. We'll get to that in a second. So far this morning, it's buy a bunch of stuff. It's buy a bunch of stuff except for Abbott Laboratories and T-Mobile and Verizon and AT&T and Coke and Pepsi. Well, other than that, you buy everything. Technology leading consumer cyclical com services, everything that's been oversold in due for a bounce. Also, it is Friday, as people are well aware, and we've had a pretty decent sell-off this week, so there's going to be a lot of covering of short positions going into the weekend, especially with this president, because you never know what's going to happen. You never know. So Fed watch for next Wednesday, remember, next Wednesday, so we're 5 days away, including the weekend, 97% that we're going to pause. So that is a done deal. We're still in extreme fear. And the breadth is back to really crappy territory, so we're going to be watching the breadth on the next bounce. Schiller PE is mid 34s. So anybody who says this market is now cheap for a bounce is out of their mind. What else? Good morning, Daniel. Okay. All right. Thank you for tuning in. So, again, Sterling put in Alta. Oh, did you put in DocuSign? I didn't say that. That was a beat also. DocuSign actually has some halfway decent PEs where it was trading. It's gapping up today. But if that was actually getting into decent valuation, not like insanely undervalued, but decent valuation, and they posted good earnings. So that's one I'm not surprised to see a bounce because of valuation. Other than that, there's nothing today. Now, more importantly, this is now technically a daily double bottom on the daily. Okay? We have cycles turning up. We're coming out of oversold conditions. Excuse me for 1 second. We're coming out of oversold conditions. Now, what are we going to do? A sideways correction, come up or have the 8 meet the price again and then rotate back down? Or are we going to trigger the little mini double? Long way off from triggering. But it is still a valid pattern. That would need a daily close above 56.75. So on any rally, guess what number I'm going to be watching even heading into next week, even if we break that key high. Now, prior to that, what are we looking at? Well, what am I looking at? I'm looking at, on a continued rally today, first of all, I'm still watching the 4-hour rotation zone, which is finally flattening out. Then I'm going to be watching this other little 62.5. Let me change the color on this. You can see the purple 62.5 and also right at this resistance base. Why? Because if we start closing above that, especially on a 4-hour basis. Then I'll start watching for a return to this high area, especially the area around the 87.5. And then I'll be watching to see if we can actually manage to close above 56.75 for a bounce play. If we roll over, because we have not been able to sustain a rally, there's still very key support at 55.50. And then below that would be 55.30. And if the key lows from yesterday, 55.09. Now, what invalidates this potential double is if we trade below 54.9875. Trade below that, it is off the table. And remember, in the bigger picture, we've now hit the second target from the weekly double top. From the weekly double top that hit last week, we've hit the second target. We still do have a very key target below. We can easily still bounce and then roll over again. However, the key thing, depending on your time frames, would be, do I want to withstand the potentially bigger bounce? Because the bottom of the rotation zone would be out of the way if this were to trigger. And I'd be really focusing on the first and second targets of this, especially the first one coming in at around 57.50. 57.50 would be a very key target. Hey, Richard. Yeah, remind me to take a look at Baidu, Daniel. We can take a look at Microsoft, John. There we go. Sterling puts in DocuSign. Thank you for that. So, is there a 15-minute double bottom on the ES? There was here. This was a completely valid from yesterday afternoon. That was a completely valid double bottom. By the way, that was completely valid. It had to be an overnight trade, but it's already hit the first target, not quite the second target if you're using conservative side. And why would I be using conservative side? Because we're against the key rotation zone still. And look at that 4-hour. I would not be using the aggressive, but that is still in play. That is still in play. So we have on the shorter term, we have still an upward bias. And what's interesting enough is the purple 62.5 is just behind the final target. Now, where would that be? If we went with conservative, it would still be behind it. So, very key. That's where I'd be watching. If you're looking in the short term, just about 56.03 is the final target for that double. But that is completely valid setup. Yes. Good morning, Anissa. Hey, you sold them on the spider. Well, if you were following your system and it said to sell them, then that's fine. You sold them. But if you were just selling them because you were afraid of something, then that's a different thing. That's why, look, do the double rules change all the time? No. Does it mean every trade works out? No. But if I follow a set of rules, because then I can consistently follow a set of rules. That's what's key to trading. It's not what you think is going to happen to you, because your mind can play, and fear can play tricks on you, and greed can play tricks on you. Again, I'm not lecturing you. If you had a very good reason to sell them, if your system said to sell them or your methodology said to sell them, then you sell them. That's what you do. You follow a methodology. NASDAQ also. Let me zoom in right here. NASDAQ has a daily potential double bottom. It would need a close of 19,788.75. Okay, same logic as the S&P. The targets, if this were to trigger, not necessarily today, but next week, it would need a massive rally today, would be 20,082.75. Then the targets, it would be 19,788.75. Then the first target would be 20,082.75, 20,229.50, 20,376.50. All right. Now, also remember, by the way, I have the not a double targets on here. I just wanted to see we're just below them. Also, I'm going to be watching. You see here, You see the 62.5, 19,594. I want to see if this closes below that on the weekly basis. It's already closed below it on the daily basis. I want to see if it falls through the weekly close below that, because that really tips again on any bounce play. Would be a bounce play only, and the magnet price would be back down 18,452 on the NASDAQ. Okay, but that would be very key. If you're looking for something shorter term, again, I'd be looking at the harmonics right here, and especially pay attention to 19,557 roughly. 19,557 on a 4-hour close. Above that, it would be above the rotation zone and above the 62.5. And then I'd watch for a follow through for next week. I would not ignore 19,635 area. There's a resistance shelf, and that's a 75% harmonic. There's a very key resistance shelf there if you're trading shorter term. The Dow. The Dow does not have any double bottom yet. Okay, so the Dow's not one. The Dow is also, unless it has a massive rally today, going to trigger its double top pattern, which could reconnect it with the 200 simple over the next few weeks. So that's what I'll be paying attention to in the Dow. The Russell, again, if you're shorter term trading, the Dow would not be my first choice. It would be either the S&P or the NASDAQ. The Russell also looks like we could see if it's going to close below the 62.5 on the weekly basis, which is 2036. And then look, we have a cluster down at the 75% harmonic, and then the overall price would shift that back down to 1848.40. Now, when these shifts, don't think it's going to, unless something catastrophic happens in the world, doesn't have to get there in the next couple of weeks. We can easily see bounces. But if I have the magnet price going lower, then I start watching aggressively for short setups at very key bounce levels. The VIX, really starting to break. I'm still watching now. I'm keeping an eye on about 23.35. We start breaking below that, we can again sustain more of a rally in the short term. The DAX, still no close below the key level and bouncing back. Going to be interesting to see if this can close above 23,039 to shift the probabilities back to retest the high area and maybe making a stronger topping pattern. The notes still has a potential double top in play. Yesterday's low of 110.12.5 was exactly the low, so this is not confirmed. It had to trade through it, and definitely not triggered, but still potentially in play. The yields have confirmed but not triggered the double bottom. So confirmed but not triggered. So I'm still watching. Now this will be interesting because the daily rotation zone would be out of the way. So that's going to be very interesting to see if this does trigger. Now remember, we're going into a Fed meeting next week. Dollar index. Trying to carve out some kind of move down here, but still favors probability-wise lower prices. Right key for me is the two twin top area. Well, it's a multi-top area to see if we get the bigger bounce above 103.70. Other than that, it's there's not great setups. We got 8 pushing the price with cycles going to the top. So I'll be watching for another rollover play next week. See if that breaks new lows. Crude still technically has the potential double bottom on the table, but this is looking like it's going to turn into a sideways correction. So key, if you're looking short term, I'd be watching yesterday's high and low. Gold spiking 30. We had 30.15 as a harmonic, spiking to 30.17, so 3,017, and pulling back, trading right at the minor harmonic right now, 3,006. Very overbought with cycles getting to the top. Now, with this, remember the double, which never confirmed or triggered? It went through the 3,006 level, so that is potentially off the table. So that's what I said. Longer term, even medium term, there's no now topping pattern in place. Key support comes back in between about 29.70 to 29.50 on any pullback. The next target, oops, I was trying to hit delete. The next key target price is 3,063 on a continued rally. Copper, also, this is just turned into a sloppy mess with no double on the table anymore. $5 is still the next magnet price. Copper still grinding higher. Silver, breaking out, finally taking out that 87.5. Finally, it took forever. Why did those levels move? Maybe it didn't. No, it technically didn't. We're just in front of it. My levels moved, but it's right there. Now your very key support on silver is back at around 33.70. The yen, not much to talk about there. Let's just take a look at the spiders, then we'll get some other stuff. Spiders, is this a valid double bottom? Well, let's measure it out. Let's take a look. We got to get the right peak. It's a little lopsided, but it is still valid. So you do have a potential double bottom here to watch for, just like in the futures, to see if that triggers next week, which could take it back to a very key resistance level of 575.70. The trigger point on that is 564.02 on a closing basis. Remember, it needs to follow through with a daily close. So, today, if you're looking for the key levels, again, I'd be watching these little minor harmonics. So it would be key for me. We have very key resistance trading virtually there right now. Is a little higher, 556.65 and then 558.64 on a closing 4-hour basis. Shifts the probabilities for to retest the high area, but not necessarily the trigger of the double. All right. To the downside, just use your harmonics areas, and remember yesterday's yesterday's opening price is going to be key also. Yesterday's opening price of 558.49. The Qs also potential double bottom. So that's something to watch for next week also. There you go. The trigger is 481.06. Bitcoin, not much to talk about just yet. It's coming up against very major resistance of 84,200. So we're going to have to see how it reacts there. It means a lopsided double means, like in the spiders, you see how you might jump to this as being the key trigger point? It's actually not. It's this. That's why it's lopsided. The top is lopsided. It's not in the middle. Slightly changes the probabilities, but not enough to invalidate it. Tesla, again, on any continued rally, I'm watching for rollover plays. A little down move yesterday, but I'm really watching for this to possibly kiss the 200 away before our next little rollover play. Not much to talk about there. We had Baidu. What else did I miss? Who said Baidu was a... This is way too sloppy to be a double. And if you look here, I mean, if you want, does it qualify? It qualifies if you use these targets. The problem is with this thing, I guess it's technically right. You're technically right, Chris. It's very sloppy, though. I'd have to look up on something like this. It does, because it's reversing this move, so but it's still a multi-bottom. It's just not the highest probability double. But thank you for pointing that out. What else did I miss? Good morning, Mark. How are you doing today? Thank you for tuning in. You're late for class? Good morning. Well, Jacob, you'll have to watch the... It technically qualifies. Technically, it's not the strongest pattern, Daniel. Thanks for pointing it out. Oh, I looked at Tesla. There's just nothing besides watching for bounce rollover plays. Microsoft, that's the one I was looking at. Microsoft, this is technically potentially going to trigger the weekly double top. Remember, it had to get back above the 75% harmonic, which it did. Now, these targets, unless it gets a major rally today, so it has to get and close back above it. Either way, it's confirmed. But if it closes back above 385.58, it's technically not triggered. But that's another key topping pattern. Also, another one. Here you go. This, unless Apple gets a rip your face off rally, it's triggering today. What does that mean? Does that just mean I would pile in shorts? No, I'd start watching because a lot of these things are still very oversold. What I'd be doing is watching for bounce plays and then any kind of rollover setups. Because this does not have to play out instantly. This could be, look at this, look at where the 200 is on the weekly. This could take a few weeks to maybe, a couple months to play out. So, also remember, if I get out of the way here, look at where the PE is on Apple, 34.5. That is not cheap by any means. And Apple's not growing substantially, if at all, in some key areas of their business. So, from a fundamental standpoint, this can easily still go much lower. So I'm keeping an eye on some of these topping patterns that are triggering. Remember, Amazon already hit its key target and forming. Here's another little to the long side against the key target from the wedge. We take that key target line. We can take some of these things off. But you're still in the vicinity. What would be interesting is this. Don't know if this one will ever trigger for a bounce into the rotation zone. But again, that would trigger back above the 200 simple. It might never trigger before the next rollover play, but that's one to keep an eye on also from a mega cap perspective for a bounce. Confirmed, let me use Amazon as an example. The pattern is confirmed, which means the pattern is in place. It can't be modified. If Amazon were to trade above the peak of 201.52, it's confirmed. Because a pattern is confirmed does not necessarily mean it has to trigger. It has to trigger on the time frame that it was developed. All right, the time frame which this one is on a daily, so it has to follow through with a daily close. So if you're trying to trade something intraday, let's say intraday it starts breaking above 201.52, but does not follow through with a close, it's not technically triggered. And from my perspective, I do not hold them. All right? So confirming confirms the pattern, and now it's set in stone. Until it's confirmed, the pattern can modify. You've seen it where the potential targets change because maybe we make a new low. Or maybe once it's confirmed, it also can keep extending. Remember the rule that you count between the bottoms? Now, once it's confirmed, it doesn't matter how far it extends before it triggers. If it does not confirm, if it extends too far to the right, the double comes off the table. So that's the difference. Also remember a shorter term pattern can still, so the higher the time from the pattern, so a 15-minute double is not nearly as strong as a 1 hour double, which is not nearly as strong as a 4 hour double. We had a 4 hour double. All right. See this 4 hour double confirmed right here. You see this double bottom, potential double bottom, confirmed. Did it trigger? Did it close above this peak? No, it did not. Then it turned into a triple on the 4 hour basis. So we have no pattern on a 4 hour basis. However, with yesterday's price action, we have a rotation in here. It shifted to a potential daily double. This might go off the table. If the S&P drops again, that's going to be potentially off the table. However, this is why you don't go, oh, we have a 4-hour setup anymore. No, we don't. There is no 4-hour setup. So it needs to follow through with a daily close, which is harder to do. All right? You see here on the NASDAQ. Technically, on the 4-hour, it turned into, see how this traded above here? We had a little mini double, traded above the key high, but never closed above it. So it was confirmed on the 4-hour, but never triggered. And then it came down to invalidate the pattern, turning into a triple. However, just because it is a triple on a 4-hour does not mean you can't have a double on the daily. This just makes it harder for it to trigger because it has to now, not just a 4-hour close above this, it has to follow through with a daily close. That's why time frames are important. I hope that makes sense. Lowe's is interesting. Lowe's is definitely interesting. It is at the 87.5 from the short term against the weekly 200. So, do we have a magic bottoming pattern just yet? No. Trend is still down, but it is very oversold. If you get a bottoming pattern on a shorter time frame, it could be valid for a bounce play. Now, it's also interesting. Look at this. Here's another thing. So remember, this is the most recent harmonics. We've completed it. Remember, it closed below it back in February. Little bounce and then a rollover play. Little bounce into the weekly rotation zone and then a rollover play. Completing that rule. Now look, this is why. If it bounces only, let's say you get a little short-term setup, it bounces, maybe even back to 235. Then rolls over. If it falls back down with a close below 221.29, would I touch this thing to the long side? No. Because this could all the way come back down to 195 area before it's complete. All right? So this could be set up for a bounce play. It is interesting. But would this be something I get married to? Now, P to E is not bad right now. So again, on a bounce play, it would have to really confirm, and I'd watch for trailing. I would trail this and be prepared for another rollover if it does set up a bottoming pattern, which we do not have yet. All right, just going into the open, not much else to talk about. You still have the remaining little 15-minute double to potentially play out. That's really about it. I hope everyone has a wonderful Friday and a fabulous weekend, and I will see everyone next week. Bye for now.